I guess more than probably any other sport, the relationship between racing and government is pretty much all-encompassing. It's certainly critically important. From one end to the other, racing is subject to decisions, often oversight by municipal government, local, national levels of government as well. And those decisions and the oversight has profound influence, of course, over the sport and indeed the whole business of racing. No two jurisdictions, almost certainly around the whole world, are the same. The involvement, though, of government in racing is at every key touch point. So planning approvals for the development of racecourses, event management regulations like the sale of alcohol, advertising controls, the regulation of gambling, including determining the capacity for punters to bet by way of pari-mutuels, fixed odds or betting exchanges, the development and the oversight of racing integrity structures and disciplinary processes, equine welfare, and the prevention of cruelty to animals legislation, of course, and other welfare-related measures. It is a very long list, and it goes on and on. Capturing revenue from wagering is just one area in which racing bodies and government interact to ensure that the racing industry is funded and can operate effectively. And certainly from where I come from in the UK, the case of the Horse Race Betting Levy Board is an interesting one. The Levy Board is a statutory body. It has as its sponsoring government department the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. It collects a statutory levy from the horse racing business of bookmakers and the successor company to the Tote as well. More recently, we've seen the role of the levy board in capturing revenue from bookmakers located offshore, and that's been an important challenge for a considerable time for the industry. Now, the Levy Board is one of the key contributors to the financing of racing in Britain. The majority of funds raised are applied to the development of horse racing. And in the Levy Board, we see the influence of government on one of the most crucial aspects of racing, and that is the money, the funding for the sport. From the creation of the legislation establishing the board and its powers and functions through to the ongoing departmental oversight of the board, you can see how government can have a direct influence and impact upon the sport of racing. So today we have quite a formidable panel of leaders here with deep experience of the many different areas where the racing industry and the government interact. And our aim over the course of this session is to explore the different ways in which racing engages with government as a stakeholder, and indeed vice versa, and to identify strategies to help racing authorities maximize the success, unlock the potential, if you like, of this most important relationship. So what I'd like to do straight away is invite our panelists to come and join me up on the stage here. The Honourable Martin Pakula, who's the Minister for Jobs, Innovation and Trade, the Minister for Tourism, Sport and Major Events, and the Minister for Racing, and a member of, for Keysborough from Victoria. Martin, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Please take a pew. Andrew Harding, you know very well, of course, Andrew is the Secretary-General of the Asian Racing Federation. Andrew, thank you very much. Bernard Saundry is the CEO for the New Zealand Thoroughbred Racing. Bernard's also spent 14 years with Racing Victoria, and his background goes beyond racing. The Western Bulldogs Football Club, and was also CEO of Harness Racing in Victoria. And Moses Tembi. Moses, thank you very much for joining us. Chair of Pumalela International, so we will be getting perspectives from a variety of different directions, and thanks very much indeed for giving us your time. As I said, this is quite structured because I think it's important partly in a purely educational sense as to work out the different ways in which governments do interact with racing, and therefore the different opportunities perhaps to understand better the ways in which racing can interact with government. So I'm going to run through a series of questions, gents, which I will address to each of you to get the varying countries' perspectives. And Martin, I think we should start with you. The question itself reads like blindingly obvious in that it says, in your jurisdiction, is there a minister for racing? Well, given that he's sitting here, there quite clearly is. But I think that perhaps the important part of it is where that role fits within your department, within the structure of government.
Well, as you said at the outset, I'm Minister for Racing amongst a range of other portfolios. The responsibility for the management and governance of racing is a bit split. So in terms of the government department that houses the Office of Racing, in our government it's the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions. In the last Parliament it was the Department of Justice. It tends to follow the Minister around. So the Office of Racing moved when I moved from the Attorney General's role. In terms of the governance of racing, look, I think it's fair to say that overwhelmingly the responsibility lies with the Principal Racing Authority, with Racing Victoria, and to an extent with Racing Australia. Government, in the Victorian context, our role is for a number of things. The legislation behind the Racing Act, the legislation that governs the integrity structures, whether that's the Racing Integrity Commissioner or the appeals mechanism for disciplinary matters, the appointment of the Board of Racing Victoria, which moved to government a few years ago. Obviously, the legislative environment around wagering and the financial consequences of that for the industry, and things like the funding of some parts of racing infrastructure through a fund that I control as Minister. But the day-to-day management of racing remains with Racing Victoria and then cascades down through the metropolitan clubs and Country Racing Victoria. So I think as a politician, not a full-time racing administrator, I certainly wouldn't want to be involved in the day-to-day running of racing, but many of the structures that sit around racing, that falls within my responsibility.
Right, so that's sort of more oversight there as a role to play. Thank you very much for the context there. Bernard, let me turn to you, if I could now, in terms of your relationship with government and where it fits in New Zealand.
So there has been a racing minister since 1990 in New Zealand, and our current racing minister is also the Deputy Prime Minister, so we've got a heavy engagement through Winston Peters. And we're in the middle of quite a large reform agenda. 2 years ago, John Massara was commissioned by the government to review the industry. He's come up with 17 recommendations, and we're currently in the second phase of the reform process, having introduced a bill in 1st of August 2019, and the second bill is currently being debated and through select committee. So we've been heavily engaged, particularly with the DIA. The government has also appointed a transition agency, and so the last 2 years has been all about government. And from racing's perspective, it is changing the game for us, because previously the New Zealand Racing Board, effectively the TAB, were the group that interacted with government, and very much the recommendations going forward is a code-led review of racing, and racing needs to also make sure that we understand the politics and we engage with the politicians and the various departments of government.
Does it say something to you that the remit falls under the Deputy Prime Minister?
It's Winston Peters has a long association with racing. He loves his racing, and that's great to have for racing. Like in Victoria, there's been, like Martin and others have had a fantastic connection and commitment to racing, and we're fortunate to have Winston in that position at the moment where we can affect some change.
Andrew, I introduced you as your Secretary-General of the Asian Racing Federation. Of course, your position within the Hong Kong Jockey Club is critically important to this panel. Hong Kong, a very particular territory with a very particular relationship to government.
Yes, we don't have a racing minister, David. We do, so far as gambling-related matters, have a regulator, the Home Affairs Bureau, which is a policy bureau, and it's also the authority that issues the the licences for betting on soccer, horse racing and the Mark VI lottery. It also appoints what's called a Betting and Lotteries Commission, which advises on policy matters in relation to gambling and provides secretarial support to the BLC. And the Home Affairs Bureau also oversees the club's approach to responsible gambling. But of course, racing in Hong Kong now bridges the border with the mainland, with the operation of Chung Fa, and that brings a whole new set of government relationships as well. The fact that we can move horses across the border, that we can import feed, import medicines, that we can treat our horses with veterinarians that are professionals not from the mainland. All of those things depend on government approvals from customs, approvals from Ministry of Agriculture, which is also responsible for the maintenance of the equine disease-free zone, which is essential to the Chung Fa project. And through that network of government relationships, we now see Chung Fa as really an embodiment of the Greater Bay Area strategy, a world-class racing facility in the mainland, seamlessly integrated with our world-class racing in Hong Kong.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thanks for the perspective. Moses, in South Africa, the situation here?
Look, as far as the legislative environment is concerned, it's a bit complicated, and I'll tell you why. The licensing component is regulated nationally under the Department of Trade and Industry, while every one of the 9 provinces has a provincial Department of Economic Development with the same function. This often leads to inconsistencies in the manner in which the provincial MECs interpret national legislation, for example. It also means that a company like Phumelela, which is a listed entity, by the way, goes through 10 processes, 1 nationally and 9 provincially when dealing with government.
Okay, thank you very much, Prince. We'll expand on that as we go. So let's have a look at some of the issues for engagement then between government and racing, government as a stakeholder in racing. Martin, you've laid out really there the areas of oversight. What then, given those, what are the real challenges you see in the way in which you do piece together racing and government?
Oh, look, there are a huge number of challenges in the industry. It is an industry that tends to find and create challenges. I think that's probably replicated all around the racing world. The ones that have been talked about today are fairly obvious: integrity, welfare. I characterise it as sort of government would like to probably stay out of it more than it does, but when reputational issues come to the forefront, government gets drawn into it, whether it particularly wants to be drawn into it or not. Government is expected to act, whether it's to change legislation, to ensure prosecutions, to put in place better structures. The funding of racing is something that's probably done differently all over the world. In Victoria, the overwhelming funding comes through the wagering licence, through the pari-mutuel wagering licence, and through race fields, which are particularly levied on corporate bookmakers, and the government has a role in setting that framework. There's also been, in the last few years across Australia, a point of consumption tax which has been introduced. So wagering licences and taxation regimes are very important parts of the relationship between the industry and government. And then government has a role to play, I think, in the provision of racing infrastructure. Now, you already focused on, or you mentioned planning regimes, but sometimes it's more directly about the provision of funding to ensure that racing infrastructure can be updated and maintained. And I think government also has a role to play, you know, and the industry does this very well, but ensuring that racing is not just about the big metropolitan tracks, but it's about the way that it supports communities. And we saw an example in Victoria just last weekend. We had parts of the state devastated by bushfire. There was a country cup meeting, a picnic race meeting at a place called Buchan, which was a track that had been burned. Government support was able to ensure that that meeting went ahead and they had their biggest crowd in their history. Now, that's just one example of the way that government can help to ensure that the community focus of racing is maintained. And I think that's a very important part of pushing back against those people that want to shut the industry down, because a lot of those people have no conception of how important racing is in regional communities.
And was that decision about community or commerce? What was it based on, and what was the extent? You said it's government support. What was the extent of that support?
Oh, we provided a funding package, something in the vicinity of $25,000, just so that the club could put on a bigger and better meeting and have better attractions, make sure they were properly marketed. That was about ensuring, I think, that the community element of racing, you know, there's no commercial upside in that fundamentally, although there's a bit of regional tourism element to it, but fundamentally it was about ensuring that that community could come together at the place where, you know, they always have, which is at the racetrack. And, you know, that is, again, it's about demonstrating that racing's not just about, you know, the high rollers, and it's not just about the metro clubs, it's about communities all across the state and all across the country, and which is something that I think the opponents of racing have a very poor understanding of.
And can I just ask, did they come to you, or did you actively go to them?
We announced a structured funding round for clubs which were affected by bushfire, and they applied to that fund.
Right, okay, thank you very much. Bernard, just going down the same route for a moment, the major challenges that you find then dealing with your now Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, it's interesting, in our racing reform bill that's on the table at the moment, there's 64 references to the Minister's involvement. And we've been before the Select Committee over the last 2 weeks looking for a lighter touch in some of those areas. But we do understand, and I've always understood that, you know, it comes to important stakeholders in the racing business. There's the owner, the punter, and government. The government provides you legislation that issues wagering licences. We will get Racefields legislation in New Zealand, and that revenue will flow throughout the course of the next financial year, point of consumption, and now zero rating the wagering tax. Without government, we can't access those revenue streams, so they are an important partner. But we do, and I'm, you know, at the same time, while we've got ministers in charge that love their racing, we have to have a belts and braces approach to make sure that future governments, if a person is put into a role like a racing minister and hasn't got a passion for racing, we have to make sure that the government and the racing industry can be aligned as much as possible. So as a regulatory body, we've pushed for, at the moment, the way the bill's been drafted, the Minister has the control of appointing the directors to the TAB and the new integrity body. We're asking for a NOMS advisory panel structure that will help have industry input and letting the Minister make the final decision. And that, I think that helps the Minister and it helps the industry in a partnership in growing the sport in New Zealand.
When you talk about the 64 references to government within that paper, and as you say, you may well have another minister to deal with in 3 months' time or 3 years, whatever it might be. Is it your preference or your concern that you diminish that reference so that it is simply more manageable with someone who sees racing as just one small part of a portfolio rather than being sort of wedded to it? Yeah,
I think the intention of the bill, and certainly the narrative in the bill that we've seen, is about a code-led and the industry getting on and managing its own commercial activities. What the bill does is give some levers to do that. So, yeah, I'm a great believer in the industry's got to manage itself, and the Minister is there when I say 64 mentions, it's around the governance structure, it's around the integrity model, it's around if the codes or the clubs get into a form of dispute. There's a new provision in the Act that says if a code and a club can't agree on excess of land assets, that there's a review process where the minister can make the final decision. So there are some positives in that, because in New Zealand we've got $1 billion worth of land assets that, when a club says leave us alone, it's go and talk to the club down the road. We need to unlock some of that value to invest back into racing to grow the business longer term. We need the government's assistance in that. So there's a balance.
Right, interesting in that respect. Andrew, let me put that to you as well then. The ways in which you interact with government, I think it is quite comprehensive, isn't it, as well, and where then the challenges are in what is a very, let's be honest, a challenging time at the moment within Hong Kong.
Yes. I don't think it's really a case in our circumstances of challenges, but the relationships are very interesting to consider. And it's a multi-dimensional relationship that the club has with government in Hong Kong, which is a product of the inherent nature of the club and also its integrated model. So in terms of the different dimensions of the relationship, I described a moment ago the regulator relationship with Home Affairs Bureau, but also there's a partnering with government, particularly as an example, the fight against illegal betting. So in 2003, the club was designated as the sole provider of legal betting on soccer as a means of diverting the illegal trade to a legitimate channel. We've, through our integrity department that reports directly to Winfred as the CEO, developed a very significant capability in identifying the scale of the problem, gathering intelligence, sharing that with law enforcement, which has assisted in sort of a crackdown on illegal gambling. We also are able to provide funding to prevent and alleviate problem gambling. We give something like $46 million US a year to that. So that's an example of a partnering with government. Going to Martin's point in terms of community, I mean, this is in the club's DNA. The club acts for the betterment of our society. And so we play an important role in Hong Kong in the delivery of social services. The club has no shareholders, or is that quite true? It has one shareholder, Hong Kong. So 95% of after-tax operating surplus goes to our charities trust, which then funds capital and non-capital projects. I gave the example on Monday night of the relief that's being provided in the current difficult circumstances, assistance to NGOs, assistance with masks. And there have been examples of that in the mainland as well. 2008, after the terrible earthquake in Sichuan, the club acted swiftly to provide funding of about $130 million US for reconstruction projects. So these are the various dimensions of the club's relationship with government.
So, I mean, compared to the way Martin was talking, this is very much hand in glove, really, of government and the Jockey Club looking at, particularly on community issues, how you can alleviate a crisis as we might have at the moment with coronavirus and handing out of masks and things like that.
Well, certainly the club sees it as a core aspect of its function, its mission, indeed. As I said, our stated mission is to act for the betterment of society. And where the club sees a need, where the club stewards or the charities trust consider that there's an avenue for providing assistance, then the club seeks to do that.
All right. Moses, again, you mentioned at the very start there, it's a complicated picture, which is for Pumalala is a challenge to deal with so many different jurisdictions at once. How do you manage that, and are there some particular specific challenges that you could refer to?
Indeed, David, similar to the political and legislative structure, the 9 provinces each have their own gambling boards which regulates betting licenses. So here again, dealing with the government is often a 9-step procedure to get one issue resolved. It's a process that is immensely time-consuming, and of course, in cases where there is litigation, it can also be a resource-consuming exercise. But insofar as the actual racing component is concerned, yes, it is self-regulatory through the National Horse Racing Authority, the NHRA. I have to add that various other provincial and national ministries take more than a passing interest, including obviously sport and recreation, trade and industry, and agriculture, etc. In a national gambling bill amendment published in 2018, but not yet on the statute books, it has been suggested that a single regulatory body be established which would appear to serve much the same function as the current NHRA, but which would be regulated by government. However, given the greater efficiencies and effectiveness, self-regulation is by far the preferred way forward from that perspective.
Yeah, which is understandable from your perspective. So, Martin, let me ask you this then. We're looking at something which is as old as the hills, racing. The traditions run deep. Everyone understands what racing is, and yet in a modern context, it's a fast-moving business and industry. So, could you just give us an idea as to how government today, modern government, if I can put it that way, would approach engaging with racing now as opposed to before? I mean, what are the changes? How's it adapting?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, as racing minister, I'm someone who has been going to the races for 40 years, had a share in a horse, worked at a racetrack, and I would say I'm entirely atypical in government. So I think the first thing that the industry probably should appreciate is that it's uncommon, I think, in government for cabinets to be populated by racing tragics and people who are motivated by their love of racing. There might be one or two people in any cabinet that are like that, but it's not common. So to that extent, racing needs to be, I think, very aware of the types of things that motivate and move governments, both positively and negatively. In a negative sense, government doesn't want to be seen to be a booster for any industry that's embroiled in scandal, that's going to be, that's going to have that's not publicly supported. So those things are very sensitive matters for government. On the other side, I think racing needs to appreciate those things which move government positively. So, we've talked about the jobs element. In Victoria, racing is a massive employer, over 30,000 people, and I think the industry needs to be always cognizant of that and always bring that to the fore of their argument. It is a massive contributor to economic growth. It is a massive contributor to tourism and indeed to civic pride. I mean, there is something incredibly gratifying about having, one of the world's most famous races, the world's richest 2-mile handicaps, having an industry which is the envy of most jurisdictions in the world. So government is, of course, moved by those things. And I go back to the issue I talked about recently, which is about the community element of racing. And I think the New South Wales government probably underestimated that when they did try to impose their ban on greyhound racing. It played well in social media and amongst, the sort of Twitterati. It got a massive backlash in regional New South Wales in community. So I think community, jobs, economic growth, tourism, state and civic pride, they are all the things that racing should focus on when they engage with government, and also understand that government is going to be pretty leery about any industry which brings upon itself scandal and public opprobrium.
I mean, just looking at your job title, if I can call it that again, but your portfolio, which is jobs, innovation and trade, tourism, sport, major events, racing is, you know, embedded obviously within all of that. Can I just ask you a question then about, for example, environment? Where does racing have to reference a different department for issues of environment?
Well, it depends on what the issue is. I mean, if racing, you know, I think you might have heard yesterday from Moonee Valley about their development. So in regards to all of the elements around that, they had to speak to the planning department, which is included in the environment department. Racing doesn't have to interact with the environment department very often because there's not a lot of crossover between what racing does and what the sorts of issues that the environment department are concerned about. But to give you one example, at Caulfield, which is, you know, our second largest metropolitan track, the Department of Environment is actually the land manager of the track, and there has been over a period of years now, which Bernard will recall, a lot of consternation about racing's exclusive use of the track versus community use of the infield. It's something that Happy Valley's done very well, something that at Caulfield I think will do a lot better in the future. So there are a few areas of crossover, but you know, racing has to interact with the Department of Justice over wagering, my department over racing integrity issues, and sometimes planning and environment over those sorts of issues, and of course the Department of Treasury and Finance, which is, we all know, the most important department.
Well, quite, yeah. And in a way, I think that was the point you were making. Jobs, 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 perhaps from your perspective, that's what racing should be focusing on in terms of winning government support, understanding, and in its lobbying.
Yeah, well, it is a major employer in our state, and you know, a fact that I never fail to press home with my ministerial colleagues. And again, and I don't want this to be all about sort of the opponents of racing, but you know, I've had conversations with some of the animal welfare lobby in the past where I've tried to make the point to them that if they had their way, tens of thousands of people would be put out of work. And I have to say their attitude is that is not their problem. Well, you know, it might not be their problem, but it's our problem and it's racing's problem. And, you know, racing needs to continue to impress that upon government.
Yeah. Bernard, we were talking there specifically about the sort of the modern world and the way in which things are changing. You've got a new bill being addressed there. Is that about just tidying up, or is that a pretty fundamental review, if you like, or attempt for an approach?
It is a fundamental review when the Deputy Prime Minister comes out publicly and says the industry's terminal, and I've now appointed John Massara to do a review. He has taken a personal interest in making sure this legislation does have a step change for the industry, and that's what we're looking to achieve. We don't agree with everything that's currently in the bill, and we've got some debates and discussions over the next few weeks, but we know we've got the support of the Deputy Prime Minister, and it goes into the government machinery, and we need to influence the DIA to make some change. But to take, in terms of modern government, I suppose what I've learned in my term in history and sport, that ministers don't like surprises. So if I sit there as an executive, one of the things that goes through your thought process, should I copy that to the minister? Should I copy that to his office? And that's a habit I've got into, been reminded by ministers in the past, why didn't you tell me?
So do you copy everything now?
And I've got a guy sitting next to me that told me that a couple of times on a journey. So I've got in the habit of saying, do I hit the button and copy the minister? Because the minister's office gets to know about it at some point in the process. And then the other side of it is, racing hasn't done well enough in selling the jobs in New Zealand. There's an economic benefit that the 3 codes of racing to deliver the New Zealand economy about 1.6 billion indirectly and directly employs 50,000 people. So there is a great story to tell, and there are people employed in the industry that may not get jobs in other industries. So it's really important that racing does a better job at telling its story, and particularly we're heading into headwinds around animal welfare. Our people So yeah, there is fundamental change, and one of the things I've learned, no surprises, keep governments informed, and then and if you've got a problem, always don't go with the problem, go with the solution at the same time.
Right, yes. Now, you've developed then pretty much a systematic approach to government. Yeah. One might wonder, and I'm sure it varies from individual to individual, whether that is reciprocated. A line like racing in this country is terminal is I expect that came as a bit of a surprise, did it? Well,
I've been there 2 years, 2.5 years, and having worked in Victoria for a number of years, it definitely needs change. And what the Minister's trying to do is get the industry activated across its participants and stakeholders and his own members within the Parliament to assist racing, and that's the pathway and the roadway we're going down at the moment. Are things changing, Andrew, in terms of relationship between the Jockey Club and government, or is it pretty well mapped out?
I wouldn't say that things are changing in terms of the relationship between the Jockey Club and the Hong Kong SAR government, but of course I mentioned Chung Fa. The club is increasingly fully engaged in the mainland, and that is a new learning experience, and perhaps the approach that we've taken to that is instructive. It starts with being properly resourced, and so the club's efforts in this area are particularly led by the Mainland Affairs team, which is part of the portfolio of my colleague Raymond Tam, who was to be here today. Raymond's background is instructive. Raymond was the Secretary for Constitutional and Mainland Affairs for 6 years in Hong Kong. And the team that he's building there is a team of similarly well-qualified people. And then in terms of the strategy, it has several elements. One is to have platforms for regular communication, which goes to the point that Bernard and Martin's made about the importance of good communication. A strategy that is built upon integrity and transparency is also essential. Again, echoing comments that have been made. Interestingly, and this may have some relevance to, say, federal jurisdictions, an important aspect of the strategy that we've developed, that we're using already, is government-to-government relations. So Hong Kong government to the different levels of government in the mainland. And certainly that's been particularly important in achieving what we've been able to do with Chung Fa and being able to obtain the approvals for the various things that I mentioned a little while ago. To the point that Martin made in terms of what politicians expect, I say this both from a Hong Kong perspective but also the experiences they had in Australia. They deserve and they will only listen to you if you have a good policy to present to them. It's a policy that's well considered, that's end-to-end. Who are the stakeholders? What's the public benefit? Where the criticisms may come? What are the answers to those criticisms? If racing hasn't taken the trouble to consider that and present that as a package, then it can't complain if it doesn't get a good hearing. And key to that is showing relevance. And so the first thing I did when I was head of the Australian Racing Board was to do the first assessment of the size and scope of the Australian racing industry to show this is why we're relevant, why even if the treasurer in the cabinet is not a racing man or woman, this is still of interest to her or him. When we had the federal government in the early 2000s proposing to ban interactive gambling, I went to each electorate in the government coalition with a local trainer, a local jockey, the head of the local race club, and if there was breeding in the area, the local breeder or the leader of the local breeding community, to show relevance, to show this is why racing and breeding matters to you. And that's always important.
That's interesting. You bring that up. I have some questions from the floor, and one references that pretty directly, actually. Not all government officials would understand the actual sport and culture of racing. How important is it for the racing industry to educate government about racing, its benefits and its risks? I think in a sense, Andrew, you've just answered that very question. But would you say, Martin, that is as true in Victoria or across Australia as it would be in somewhere like China, for example?
Oh, look, undoubtedly. Racing Victoria, I can't speak for other jurisdictions. Racing Victoria has always made an effort to create, for example, parliamentary Friends of Racing, where they come along to Parliament, invite parliamentarians to the track, try to engage with politicians as much as possible, to varying degrees of success. But I think Andrew's point, which is, you've always got to be able to tell a representative, a parliamentarian, some kind of local story about how the industry is important to them, their constituents, and their local economy. And I think that's as relevant in Australia as it is anywhere else.
Just, I want to hop back onto something I wanted to ask you, Andrew, because yours is a very unique situation, I think, if you can be very unique, it's just unique. But what is the sort of the route then of communication for you when you've got one government and then you've got another government? Do you go via Hong Kong to get to Beijing? How does that structure work?
You said there's no monopoly on the term horses for courses, so I'm going to employ that term again. It's a matter of horses for courses, and it depends on the particular issue. There are some issues upon which it's been absolutely essential that the dialogue's been assisted by Hong Kong SAR taking it up. There are other matters that we've been able to engage on directly. And I think this is another important aspect of this. The Prime Minister of Australia, John Howard, was famous for saying, you can't fatten a pig the day you want to take it to market. And it's true as well that if the first time you go to government is when you've got a problem, then you've got a problem. You've got to develop a relationship over a long time. And the club certainly has a reputation for acting for the community betterment that's been built up over decades. I take, for example, the role that the club played in the staging of the 2008 equestrian element of the Beijing Olympics. That then led to the request, because that was done so successfully by the club, to request to assist with the games that were held in Guangzhou several years later. That then is the site upon which Shungfara is built. So these relationships have a very long arc, and they depend on transparency, they depend on integrity, they depend on trust that's built up by looking at your values and your conduct over a very long period.
Okay, it's interesting. Moses, from what we've heard there, often with a problem you provide a solution to get to government to sort of get them on side. You clearly have some issue with regard to which government you're essentially aiming at and looking at. So looking further ahead then, what would you see as the key challenges requiring effective engagement with government? I mean, how do you improve the sort of efficiency and the workability of you operating with government?
I think it must be stated that there is a need in South Africa to improve the relationship between government and the racing fraternity. For historical reasons, a government still views the horse racing as an elitist sport, when in fact we must begin to see horse racing as an industry that must be supported. And to that end, I must emphasize that simply because we've allowed the litigation to be the route to solving the problems, we've not achieved the full potential, we've not harnessed that relationship that must be strengthened. As in many parts of the world, horse racing in South Africa was expected to be self-financing through the tote and betting. It was the case for a very long time before the establishment of casinos, lotteries, and sport betting. But today, you know, the market share of the total betting pool in South Africa has actually gone to less than 4%, which creates a huge challenge to sustain the industry. To this day, the horse racing industry is battling financially, and we have taken it upon ourselves that this year and going forward, we are going to be engaging government more openly and more transparently, as other speakers alluded, and established a more conducive relationship between government and a horse racing industry.
And do you say that with an air of optimism? I mean, you can see that bearing fruit?
Definitely. I think we've got a democratic government in South Africa, and which is open to discussions. We have had initial discussions with the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and which is represented today. We are going to be engaging them openly. I think they are open to the idea of engaging the horse racing industry. But I think it starts with government recognizing that it is an industry. If you look at other industries in South Africa, there are government incentives in place to support the industry to grow. I think we need to extend that support to the industry.
I want to have a little reference now to the wagering world and the relationship between government and racing here. We've got some questions to that end as well. Let's start with responsible wagering, shall we? How does the racing industry and government interact on an issue like responsible wagering? So I gave the example of the levy in the UK, for example. Bernard, would you like to start on that?
Yeah, so certainly what's very prevalent in the racing industry bill that's been drafted in New Zealand, that both the Greens Party and other parties have asked for particular introductions of harm minimisation, proper wagering practices put in place. So we are seeing the other parties having a greater role. And I'd have to say the wagering operators in New Zealand, there is one, the TAB, there are other online operators that the racing industry have signed commercial agreements with, are well aware of their obligations and are cognisant that they not only have to do the right thing by government in terms of being socially responsible, they've also got an obligation to their customers. And that has been certainly evident during my time in New Zealand.
Martin?
It's a great, and it's a very complex question. I think there's a combination of factors here between what does government do, what does industry do, and what do wagering providers do themselves, because more than once that they've acknowledged that they can either start to make moves in the responsible wagering direction themselves, or they will have them increasingly imposed upon them. So the sorts of areas where it becomes a question is, things like bonus bets and free bets and incentives to sign up to wagering service providers. The question of how much advertising is allowed, whether that's at racetracks, on television during prime time, or indeed at other sporting stadia. So that's a matter that's been constantly discussed between jurisdictions. And then there's the question of illegal offshore gambling and how much government can do to try and crack down on that. So, look, there is a recognition from government, obviously, that wagering is, it bears the lion's share of responsibility for funding the code. So there is no code without it. Having said that, it just can't be open slather where you have untrammelled incentives for people to sign up to more and more accounts. There's questions now emerging about whether or not people should be able to top up betting accounts by credit or otherwise. At the moment, you can use a credit card to top up your wagering account. I suspect that might be not long for the world. There are questions about whether or not it's appropriate for corporate bookmakers to offer free bets, bonus bets, incentives to join, and if so, what's the taxation regime on those things? So there are a shandy of issues, but at the end of the day, I think, again, this is one of those issues where racing has to draw a distinction between the way that racing people inside the bubble think about these matters and how the rest of the community thinks about these matters. And, you know, it's something that I've spoken about often. I think one of the things that racing has probably historically not done well is have a proper appreciation of how people outside the racing bubble see some of these questions.
Do you think that's fair, Andrew?
I do. I think that's eloquently put. What I'd also say is that, I mean, to put on the record the club's own sort of efforts in this area, I mentioned the amount that's given each year, and as in recognition of that, the club is the first in Asia to have achieved the World Lottery Association Level 4 certification. So this is very important to us. And if I look across this room, this is a very nice issue to deal with, because what we see in so many jurisdictions is that government, regulators, concerned about access to gambling, concerned about creating problem gambling, in many cases, I have to say, take the wrong approach, because they, for example, because they're concerned about encouraging gambling, place a taxation rate on legitimate gambling that makes it completely unappealing to the customer. So there are jurisdictions in this room that are barely operational because the taxation rate is so high. And there's very same jurisdictions in which illegal gambling, local illegal gambling, is huge. And so what I would say from an Asian Racing Federation point of view is that the right path is a measured one in which the legitimate operators have to walk the talk in terms of responsible gambling, but the conditions in which they're allowed to operate are such that they can divert to this legitimate channel the wagering, the gambling that's otherwise being serviced by the illegal market. And then when you do that, then you can practice responsible gambling. You can ensure that underage are not gambling. You can ensure that there's no credit betting. You can put other measures in place to make sure that people that do have a problem with this particular form of pastime are safeguarded.
You've tied very neatly into another question here, because anti-illegal betting, of course, is an issue that's been brought up here with the task force as well. And there is a question here, as you are sort of telling quite a few jurisdictions what they're doing wrong, what is the role of the ARF, for example, for regional and international bodies to take that lead in terms of engaging with governments as well as helping the jurisdictions?
I think that's essential. What we've done to this point is to measure the problem, to identify it, to do it with a good methodology so that regulators, governments, when we're dealing with them, can have confidence that what we're saying is accurate. The responses, in terms of effective action will necessitate government action. And that will be local, like domestic governments, but also multi-jurisdictional approaches. And I think the ARF plays a role in encouraging governments, with the assistance of domestic industries, domestic governments, to achieve the coalition to do that. But there is, and I've seen it even more keenly in my discussions with so many of you over the course of this week, there is an advocacy role that the club or the federation can play, has played in the past. We've made, and I won't mention particular jurisdictions, but we've, with good effect, travelled. Winfred made special trips to governments at the request of the local racing industry to explain to government what, with the benefit of our research, is the right policy prescription. I think there's more that the Asian Racing Federation can do.
Listening to that, Martin, I mean, our governments, whether it's yours or others, do you think they are likely to be ready to listen to something like the ARF rather than the domestic racing business?
Oh, look, I think government's open to, good submissions from any source. I think I don't think the ARF's got as big a role to play with a government like ours, because we have a very, a hugely well-developed relationship between government, Racing Victoria, and indeed Racing Australia. But certainly as Racing Minister, I've had reason to engage with Andrew over issues of mutual relevance and importance to both Victorian racing and Hong Kong racing. And there would be no difference. I mean, if Andrew, in his capacity as head of the ARF, made representations to our government, through me as Racing Minister, I would be intensely interested in those representations. Absolutely.
You mentioned that it has to be relevant, which is obvious because you've got plenty of work to do. You can't do with non-relevant issues. But here's a question that's come in about relevance. The relevance of youth and gender diversification. How much should racing be emphasising those elements of business, of its business, to you in terms of gaining your support?
Look, I think it's absolutely crucial, and I think from two perspectives. In terms of gender, I think anyone involved in Australian racing would say that over the last decade, there's probably not been anything that's happened, with the possible exception of the Winx phenomenon, there's not been anything that has captured the imagination of the broader community as much as Michelle Payne winning the Melbourne Cup on Prince of Penzance in 2015. And that is because historically racing has been, I think, reasonably poor at marketing itself to 50 plus percent of the community. And I think we're seeing an increasing involvement of women jockeys, of women trainers, of women administrators, and consequently a greater level of interest from women and girls. And we're seeing it now in cricket, in Australian rules football, an entirely new lease of life being generated for those sports by them finally embracing the women's codes in their sports. And I think for racing, it is an absolutely essential and inevitable part of the growth of the code. In regards to young people, I've said this before, I'm just a little north of 50, and I genuinely don't want to be part of the last generation of racing tragics. I want to see this code attract and appeal to younger supporters, younger punters, and in order to do that, it absolutely has to get it has to get on top of animal welfare and integrity issues. Without that, I suspect the code has no prospect of attracting the next generation of young members, young punters, and young participants. So, for our own sake as an industry, we have no choice but to have a massive focus on appeal to the young.
Do you recognise that as well, Bernard? I mean, of the issues, we all appreciate the issues, but seeing the direct line of value of taking that to government and showing what you do.
Absolutely, and on diversity, we're very fortunate in New Zealand where 45% of our jockeys are females, and we're starting to get a better representation in our training ranks. But diversity is critical, diversity of voice. We haven't got that in what I'd call administration across New Zealand. So we do need a diversification of views, and it is critical if we're going to shift the dial for the next generation. So what Martin's saying is a microcosm of what we're dealing with in New Zealand. You're
doing it already. I mean, you're ahead of the game in many senses, I think it's fair to say.
When I say there's 45% of jockeys in New Zealand are female, but then I'll step into an industry meeting and there'll have 70 people in the room, 70, 65, 70 plus, with maybe one woman in the room. So it's not good enough.
Dare I say, we're standing up here all in our nice dark suits and ties. It does say something, doesn't it? Andrew, is that a relevant question for you as well in terms of Hong Kong, looking at government and sort of trying to explain to government how much you are doing in those areas, or does that not come into your purview?
I'm not so sure it's a government issue, but I think it's well, not overstating, it's an existential issue. As Martin said, we don't want to be, we're all, I think, Moses, maybe, I think you're younger, but we're all north of 50 on this line. We don't want to be the last generation that are the sort of the people that love racing. And the club takes that very seriously. And, in some areas, we've had a great deal of success. The Happy Wednesday brand has been enormously successful in engaging with a younger audience and making racing relevant to them. Racing Club has been a fantastic initiative in terms of bringing into the club's stream of membership a younger demographic that can become the racehorse owners potentially of the future. But it's an issue that everyone in this room confronts.
Yeah, okay. I want to ask this question as well, specifically given where we've come from this morning on issues of equine welfare. The question is this, and if I can start, I should start with the Minister. Are governments, as the empowerment behind regulators, legitimately prepared to dramatically increase regulation of the racehorse from birth through to its post-racing career?
Oh, well, I think in many respects government has already done that in certain things. So when we talk about other ministries involved, so for instance, as Minister for Racing, I'm not the minister responsible for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals Act. But there's already been some substantial changes made there. I think one of the things that we need, and we haven't really talked about this much, unless it was talked about the last couple of days, some of these things are only effective if they're at the very least national. There's no point having a set of rules about registration of breeders or breeding numbers in one state and not, over the border it's different. There's no point having rules about equine traceability in Victoria, but it not being the case in New South Wales or South Australia. And there's no point having rules about whether or not horses can go to abattoirs or knackeries in one state, because it will just encourage the movement of horses across state lines. So we're as a government, we've said, and the racing ministers got together at the Racing Ministers Conference in Western Australia a couple of months ago and said very clearly, these are things which require a national approach. Now that's partly about Racing Australia, and it's partly about the Commonwealth Government. That is not about state governments devolving themselves of responsibility. It is simply a recognition of the fact that state-by-state approaches in that regard are going to be largely ineffective. So I think there is room for a national dialogue, whether it's at Racing Australia or indeed between racing and agriculture ministers with our Commonwealth counterparts about that suite of measures. Yes, I think there is an appetite for government to be much more involved in that, but it is, in my view, entirely dependent on whether there's an appetite to do that nationally.
Right, Bernard, there's an appetite from government to do that, ideally nationally. Is there an appetite from racing for governments to do that?
I think so, and I agree with Martin. It is a national issue. In New Zealand, we have started to talk about the National Traceability Program. I know it's been talked about in Australia. Ideally, they're the things we could probably do together because we have a third of our foal crop being exported to Australia. So it is a responsibility that we have, and I do believe it is a national issue and it needs to be addressed pretty quickly.
Here's a question slightly out of the box, Martin, for you. Well, it's not out of the box at all, but it's slightly off the path that we've been on for the last 20 minutes or so. And it's that societal issue, really. With larger urban populations, how do racing bodies and government work together to allow local communities enjoy racecourse land? I mean, you did give a nice example of working with local communities, but making the most of the asset.
Yep. We have some pretty good examples of it. So I touched on this earlier. We have, in Victoria, we've had for the last 10 years or so now what's been called the Victorian Racing Industry Fund, and it's about being able to use some government fund combined with industry money to leverage infrastructure development at racetracks. What we've seen in a number of regional communities is that we've been able to build things like, conference facilities, community facilities at racetracks. So, there might be a racetrack grandstand or function space that's also used for weddings and for sports nights. A number of racetracks have, within the centre of the track, football ovals. In some racing, at some country courses, you might have harness and greyhound racing combined with thoroughbred racing. But in a lot of country communities, the racetrack is one of the largest pieces of green space in that town, and it's important to be able to use the facilities for things other than racing. Sometimes that's dependent on how heavily the track is used as a training centre. You obviously can't have people going for a jog if there's a 600 kilogram beast running around behind it. But we are working really closely with local government and with race clubs to ensure that when we do make some community infrastructure spending available, we see that we can get the best community bang for our buck.
And Bernard, are you sort of pushing for that?
Absolutely, and it's something to revitalise racecourses, I believe, in regions. And we've kicked off discussions with Sport New Zealand, who, in their own right, say local sport is struggling for participation, and the more we can aggregate and share facilities. There's an area in the Taranaki where there's 19 different sports, a race course, 60 horses trained at the facility, and there's 3 business plans being prepared at the moment, all independently. We've said, why don't we come together and see if we can paint a vision for racing and sport in the future, where we're building facilities that can be used 52 weeks a year, manage the training complications that it brings. But definitely, I think the long-term solution to modernise facilities, to get people engaged in sport and in racing, requires sport and racing to work together.
Well, we've talked a lot about some of the current issues, the opportunities as well. I mean, there are tensions too, I think it's fair to recognise, inevitably in this case. But let's just have a look at the future then. And I'll start with this point. What are the key challenges, Martin, for racing, looking ahead, which require effective engagement by the authorities in racing with you?
Okay, so I think I'll go back to a point I made earlier. It's important, I think, fundamentally for racing to look outward rather than to look inward. Racing, more so than most sports, I think, is one which has its own rhythm, its own language, its own terminology, a lot of participants who are deeply, deeply engaged and committed to it. And I think that's wonderful, but one of the drawbacks of it is that, when you think about an issue like animal welfare or the use of the whip or, the way that, the sort of, clothing that people need to wear on big race days, we're focused on what do the jockeys think, what do the trainers think, what do the punters think, what do the members of the race club think, rather than what does the community think, what do we need to do to attract young people to the track, what are the things that we need to do to grow the code. So I think that's, whether we're thinking about animal welfare or whether we're thinking about whether we have a more relaxed approach to going to the races, we need to think expansively and broadly. So I think that's one thing. I think we need to acknowledge the fact that there is a growing cohort of people that do not believe that racing has a social licence, would like to see it ended, and our participants need to ensure that they are not wittingly or unwittingly assisting those people in their endeavours. And we've had, too often, some of the people that you would imagine love the code more than most have done things which have helped those arguments against racing. I think we need to recognise that racing is in a massive fight for the wagering dollar with other codes, whether it's, football betting on all sorts of things. And so, that is potentially an existential problem for the industry. We are in a very competitive environment. And to that end, we need to find the balance when we're thinking about being more modern, which is good, being more competitive, which is good. using competition to drive better outcomes, we've also got to make sure that we understand that we are dealing with a pie which is not infinite, that we need to absolutely maximise that rather than sort of unnecessarily divide up the product. That's why I've always had the view that the pattern is very important, supporting and defending it, because you want all eyes and the best horses and the best trainers and the best jockeys to focus on jurisdictions in a way that maximises the product rather than unnecessarily dividing it up. And I think we need to recognise that in regards to, if we want wagering and government to continue to support the industry, we absolutely need to have an integrity and animal welfare outcome that is second to none. And what we can't do is have a situation where we're all very active when there's something like the 730 report and we all, with the best of intentions, make commitments about how we're going to change, and then a few months later, when the heat's off, we forget about it and sort of go back to doing things the way they've always been done. This is going to keep coming back, and every time it does, racing loses skin. And so we've got to make sure that the commitments that we make in the heat of the moment are followed through on.
Now, I don't think anyone would disagree with any of those elements. Bernard, do you think they are recognised within racing as things that you have to engage with government on?
Absolutely, and we've just taken steps to change our management structure to bring a realignment of our reporting relationships to call out things like equine welfare and sustainability in our senior team, and they're long-term processes, and we've got to be committed to think outside the bubble, and I'm guilty of that, having come out of one bubble in Victoria into a bubble in New Zealand, and you've got to start to think outside of that bubble and realise that there are other community views that potentially could marginalise racing into the future. So there's a big job ahead of us. Make no mistake, the issues around welfare, the issues of our people and of our horses. Without those two assets, we haven't got an industry. And then the sustainability of the land that farmers and trainers and that we use and racetracks we use, the way they're used, the way we need to build sustainable strategies are front in mind in every other business. So we're not immune to that, and we can't be immune to that.
Andrew, that idea that Martin brought up there about the sense of an ownership of a position within society that racing has had for a long time, which is being chipped away, is that as applicable in Hong Kong? I mean, you've emphasised here that you and Hong Kong government recognise a community essence to what you're doing. Is that being chipped away at, and is that a future challenge?
I don't think, David, it's been eroded or diluted. I think it's as strong as ever. I mean, racing, the handover, famously it was said, and racing will go on, and it has. And it's so, what I'm struck by, particularly over the last 12 months of the various difficulties that Hong Kong's faced, is how resilient racing is and how much of a hold it has in terms of the public affection, the public interest in it. If I go to that shopping list of issues, I couldn't agree more with the way Martin's put it. I think so far as welfare is concerned, worldwide, it's not an issue that government's going to be able to solve for us. If it comes to the point of government having to take action, I think we have to be worried, because what action will they be forced to take by public opinion? I think our challenge there is to ensure that we have good strategies, and that in terms of communicating them, we communicate very, very closely with government as a stakeholder. In terms of what I think are the future issues, and I say this across the Asian Racing Federation, it is anti-illegal betting for the reasons I gave a moment ago. Taxation is so much the companion to that issue. The taxation rate in a number of jurisdictions is driving the customer into the hands of the illegal betting operator. But beyond that, this conference is about unlocking potential. And it doesn't really apply in the Australian jurisdiction, but in so many other jurisdictions within the Asian Racing Federation, unlocking potential does depend on having a successful dialogue with government across a range of things. Is wagering off course allowed? Are you allowed to advertise the fact that you're conducting a race meeting Forget the fact that there's wagering. Are you allowed to advertise that a race meeting is being conducted? Can you offer wagering interactively by the internet or not? Are you allowed to offer off-course wagering? Simulcasting. Can jurisdiction A have a separate pool arrangement with jurisdiction B? Governments control that. Commingling, that great hope that we spoke of in the first session, that crucially depends on governments. Government regulators agreeing to the pooling of the linking of pools at all, whether that's possible at all, and then the conditions upon which it's allowed. No double taxation. The super pool in Australia was only made possible because the Victorian government said, with a vision, no double taxation. The bet will be taxed in the jurisdiction in which it's placed. And the Victorian government said, we won't take it. If it's a bet that's placed in South Australia, we won't take any tax on it. That made commingling possible. So too internationally. But for commingling to grow, every government has to accept that. So for me, these are the challenges that we really do need across the Asian Racing Federation to engage with government on.
And Moses, that's a long list there. But in terms of the future, of unlocking potential, how better and in what way do you think that racing in South Africa can work, can engage with government?
We had a meeting before this session, a meeting of the various stakeholders who are involved in the industry. I'm talking from the private sector side. What came out clear there is that we definitely have to improve the relationship among the stakeholders as the private sector. And I must say that the meeting demonstrated that we really can work together and must work together. We had a very constructive engagement at TIC. I think once you've got that in place, you definitely have got to improve a strong partnership with government ensuring that when it says this partnership, it's not only in word, but it is in deed. And the second challenge or the opportunity really is one of ensuring that we could come up with a sustainable financial model to ensure that we are able to secure the future of the industry. And that talks to the taxation of the industry, that talks to the incentives that we could get from the Department of Trade and Industry, for example. And finally, I really think that in South Africa, we have to go all out to ensure that the sport is inclusive to address the imbalances caused by history in this country. And I think that we are on the right track to ensuring that all the people of South Africa get to enjoy the sport, but get to participate in the industry that is likely to continue to employ more people if every party put his hand on the deck.
I think it's clear that, racing brings so much to the party and to the table, and government has to enjoy that aspect and appreciate it. But by the same token, from what we've heard here, you can't stop telling government often enough of what you are doing and how you do benefit communities and how you are improving and enhancing the sport of racing at the same time. That's the sort of takeaway that I'm getting from what you've all had to contribute this morning. Thank you very much indeed. We've covered a lot of ground in the course of the morning. Ladies and gentlemen, for our panel, thank you very much for that.